All right, I'm going to finish up the ethics lesson by going over some examples, some different scenarios that you may come across in your engineering career. We talked about the Ford Pinto and we realized that the engineers made a poor decision. Yes, there was accounting people in on it also, but engineers should have really raised a red flag and not worried so much about the trunk space, but really worry about the health, safety, and welfare of the public, right? That's number one on the engineering ethics, code of ethics that we have. Also, I mean, if you use some of the tests that we had talked about, right, the reversibility test, would you want to put your kids in a car like that? No, of course not, right? Or the publicity test, do you want people to find out that you let that go based on trunk space? You're letting people die in flames? Yeah, bad, bad news. So that's a real easy, obvious example. A harder example is one like this. Let's say you just graduated from college and you've been working on a new product, and it has features X, Y, and Z. And as you're working on these features of, as you can see, X, Y, and Z, we know that X is working, right? It works great. We haven't finished Y and Z yet. We don't know how they're going to work. So one day, marketing comes in and says, you know what, we're going to sell this new concept to these people, these investors, right? And we want to show them what you have. Can you put a presentation together? And you agree to do that. You put the presentation out and you send it to marketing. The next day you go in and marketing says, thanks, great, everything looks great. We made a few changes though. And you look at the changes, and those changes are such that they say X, Y, and Z, these are the features we have, things are looking great, and on and on and on. When in reality, we don't know yet, right? We haven't tested the others. So they're taking your data and lying about it, right? That is not an ethical thing, right? That isn't part of the code of ethics of helping and making sure that your client is also not being deceived, right? So that goes against all of that, right? So you say, no, 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 we need to keep that data in there. And they disagree with you and say, oh, we've done this lots of times. You're new at this, let it go. And you're nervous, right? So what do, right? It's your data and you know it's not right. You can do the different tests, the ethical tests, and you know that it's just not right to do. You're going to be harming these people financially, right? If things go bottoms up on it. At least be truthful with them, right? Let them know you haven't finished it and you haven't tested it, but it may look good, right? So what do? You could say, okay, no, I'm not going to do it, right? Or whatever. But this is a situation where you just graduated. So you've got some loans out there. Maybe you just got married, right? You have a wife and you have a kid on the way and you just bought a house. So you have all this financial stress on you, right? You've got to keep your job. So you could go to your boss and say, this is a problem. What should I do? And the boss could say, you're right. Don't do this. Don't let that out, right? Or the boss could say, it's okay. This is marketing. They know what they're doing. Just let them handle it, right? You can handle it, right? Well, that's not a good thing, right? So you could refuse to go, right? You could refuse to go, and the boss would say, okay, then I'll give it to Bob, right? Bob will present your data instead, and it'll be all right. That's kind of giving you a bad situation because your job could be in jeopardy. So you can see how this can be really bad. I mean, you could go along with them and not present the data, and marketing would say, "Oh, just come along, and we'll present the data. You just sit there." Well, they're sitting there, and you're there as the spokesperson for that data. So again, you're in a bad situation. Sometimes you get in situations like this, and you really need to stand your ground, right? Especially if you're going to be potentially harming someone else. So that's why sometimes it seems like, oh, the obvious, easiest thing to do. But sometimes there's other things that are going on that make these decisions very, very difficult for us. Here's a quick question. Engineers should follow their professional code of ethics because A, it helps them avoid legal problems such as getting sued. We know that that's not why we're doing it, right? It provides a clear definition of what the public has a right to expect from responsible engineers. Hmm? It raises the image of the profession and hence gets engineers more pay. Well, that isn't the reason engineers get more pay. They get more pay because not everyone can do this line of work, right? The public will trust engineers more once they know engineers have a code of ethics. That doesn't seem right. The real answer is that it provides a clear definition of what the public has a right to expect from responsible engineers. The Code of Ethics is really designed to promote the public welfare, and the public has a right to expect that responsible engineers will follow each of those provisions. Many of you probably know the whole situation and in Flint, Michigan with the lead water crisis. I mean, that's a huge ethical one, right? Where the water engineer district gave misleading reports and manipulated the data, tampered with reports, all those things. Of course, when it gets out into the public was really bad. And it also hurt a group of people, right? And it could have been avoided, right? This was really a bad situation. This person got 2 counts of misconduct, 1 count each of conspiracy to tamper, and so on. So they got in big trouble for doing this. It is something that you should not do. The next example, this is actually a true story. It's a medical device company develops a stent-like device for patients suffering from abdominal aortic aneurysm, a life-threatening condition that affects 200,000 people in the U.S. annually. The device has FDA clearance and is initially hailed by cardiac surgeons as a life-savings device. However, problems develop with the device and a few people experience such severe complications from insertion of the device that they die. Members of the company decide not to report the failure to the FDA. They significantly downplay the complications of the device, and even though a third of the surgeries see some complications. The company's sales representatives are often involved in discussions with the VPs about what to report to the FDA. And one of the VPs, a former MBA student from Madison, becomes aware of the flawed data being reported to the FDA and argues that they need to correct the problem. His arguments are dismissed by the other VPs as out of touch, and the company continues to market the device. One of your homework problems will be similar to this, where you have to rate how ethically acceptable or unacceptable it is, right? And you need to justify it using those harms tests that we had discussed, right? So these tests that we had discussed before, right? So these are all the ones that we're looking at. So, you know, you can think about it as the publicity test, right? As an engineer, would you want people to know that you're letting all these people die, knowing that this data is being kept from the FDA? That would be really bad for engineers, right? The reversibility, would you want to use this device on yourself or someone else that you loved? That would be a really bad situation. So if we look at this situation, I mean, it is a very bad situation, but there's a number of things we kind of have to take into account. One thing is these people are on life-threatening condition that affects 200,000 people annually. So these people are going to die no matter what if nothing happens, right? So maybe this device is okay, right? I mean, it's saving some, and a third of them have complications. And if we look at that, you know, in the test, the utilitarian one, does this option do the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And with that, you might say, yes, 2/3 of the people are okay. The question comes in, though, is there another device that does this also, and how effective is that one, right? And there is another device that does exist, and it does better, right? So hiding this data is not good, right? It might also be another thing if, you know, it was the only device out there and it was still having these rates, is to really let the patient know, right? Let the patient know their options. If they choose to still use the device, that's perfectly fine, right? They know the percentage of people that still will die from it and the ones that will live. In the end, on this whole thing, they did get in trouble. The engineers lost their job and had a hard time finding other jobs in the medical device industry because of this. So it's something that you really need to consider. I had a friend that worked at a company, at a medical device company, and I worked at one also. And he's worked at the same company, but prior to that, he worked for a different one. And they had a cast cutting, or not a cast cutting saw, but a skull cutting saw that would cut into your brain, right? Not into the brain, but into the skull to be able to do brain surgery. And the device was such that it had a trigger that could turn off automatically once it got through the skull. Well, there were errors with it in their testing, and they found that a lot of times the saw didn't stop, which would be bad because it would go right into the brain. He had all this data, reported it to his superiors. The next day, when he came back to work, he went to his desk, and all the data was missing. He chose to leave that company, right? He didn't want to be part of that, right? So that's another option that you can also have and may have to do. Sometimes as engineers, like I told you, we face a lot of different problems, right? From allocating funds and projects, right? There might be not enough funds for a project. How does that affect the general health safety of the entire public? So sometimes we have other things that occur that make things difficult for us. Just like even those personal issues, right? We want to really kind of make sure that we are careful on that. So sometimes with the project funds, there's the case of the bridge in Minnesota that collapsed a few years ago. And it collapsed because typically when you build bridges, you build redundancy, and it's such that if something fails, the redundancy part of the design will keep holding the bridge up, right? This bridge didn't have these redundancies because of costs. But the bridge was past its useful life, right? It was past the useful life. It was carrying traffic more than it should have. The inspections already showed that there were flaws and things that were in the problems with it, and nothing was done. So the engineers, even though they did a really good job, probably felt really bad that their bridge failed, right? Even though they did nothing wrong, right? So it's a hard situation. All right, this is the last example that I want to go over. Should or shouldn't engineers design semi-automatic rifles, right? So this is one that we need to really think about. And really, this isn't an engineering ethics decision, it's a personal decision. If you don't feel comfortable designing them, you shouldn't design them. If you do design them, when the engineering ethic decisions come into play is if there's something that may malfunction in the rifle such that it would harm the user, that is an ethical decision that needs to be brought to the attention of the company and the people, right? There's where the engineering ethics come from, not whether you're going to design them or not. That's a personal decision, personal ethical decision on your own, but it's not an engineering ethics decision. All right. So I hope you kind of gain some idea of what ethics is. It's a very kind of deep subject and kind of hard subject to grasp sometimes. But it is very important. As engineers, we have a lot of responsibility for our designs, and they can affect a lot of people. So we need to be very responsible and careful on the decisions that we make.